Welcome to our series of healthcare scene interviews where we sit down with top leaders in healthcare IT. I'm John Lynn, the founder of healthcarescene.com, a network of leading healthcare IT resources. You can check out all the details at healthcarescene.com. And before we begin our interview, I want to thank our sponsor for this interview, Intel. They've sponsored this interview and a number of video interviews we've done. So thank you so much, Intel.
In healthcare, the future is already here. Hospitals are applying data analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence to uncover new insights in patient care. Could that data help identify which patients are at risk of sudden decline? That's what the data science team at Sharp Healthcare in San Diego set out to prove.
Organizations like ours have invested in these systems, and now we're looking for something we call the digital dividend. We've collected all this data. Perhaps there's some gems of information which we could turn into knowledge, which we could then turn into wisdom to help us look after our patients better. What we want to do is give that rapid response team a tool to help them make those identifications even earlier. We are doing a proof of concept project here. So far, the results are very encouraging.
Intel helped bring together a data science team from Sharp, Cloudera, and ProKarma. They looked at 2 years' worth of data from patients who had serious events in the hospital. They identified the factors that led to those events and developed predictive models to produce a patient risk score.
The patient risk score that we developed was actually a score from 0 to 10, 10 being most likely to need an intervention.
The data that we collect, obviously it's things like their vital signs, your blood pressure, your heart rate, your respiratory rate. It's also laboratory data, your white count, your red count, your electrolytes. Rapid response teams love this.
Because the rapid response team collaborated with the development of the algorithm and provided their expertise in which information they thought would be most relevant, they were really partners in the development. Therefore, they have built-in trust with what we're doing. One of the most exciting and surprising things about this whole process was that we were actually able to predict with an 80% accuracy rate whether or not a call was going to be made within the next hour.
Can we identify events earlier using this data that's available to us? Yes, we can. If we can make good decisions in a more timely fashion than we do today, patients can go home earlier, patients can avoid complications.
With powerful insights driven by predictive clinical analytics, the future makes hospitals more perceptive every day.
Now, our special guest today is Andy Bartley. He's the Senior Solutions Architect in the Health and Life Sciences Group at Intel. Welcome, Andy.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me on. I'm a big fan of the work that you do covering healthcare.
Thanks. I'm excited to learn from you. I mean, predictive analytics is such an important topic. But before we get to that, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work at Intel.
Yeah, thanks, John. So, a lot of folks don't know that Intel has a dedicated healthcare team. We've had a dedicated presence in healthcare for about 15 years. Obviously, when folks think about Intel, they think about technology, but we do a lot of work with policy and with standards bodies to help make sure the ecosystems around healthcare payers, providers, and life science organizations are all open and interoperable. I have a really fun role here at Intel. I get essentially paid to work with healthcare organizations around the world to find innovative ways to solve their problems. It's a pretty wide charter, so I'll work on solutions ranging from how to deliver desktops in a secure way, given the kind of security climate that we find ourselves in with breaches today in healthcare, how to improve mobility after adopting EMRs, and most recently, a lot of work around how to find new and innovative ways to apply data. And so predictive analytics is a big kind of focus within that. The unifying theme in all that is the role of technology. And again, it's a pretty unique role in that we Intel and healthcare don't sell anything to end users. So I never come in to collect a PO. All of our processors end up in, technology made by folks like Dell or Lenovo or HP or Cisco. So, we really get the opportunity on our team to work as trusted advisors with healthcare organizations, talking about business problems. And we sort of serve as this, neutral view across technology, and we're able to come in because of the variety of technologies that we work with to help advise folks on that. Prior to Intel, I've been in and around healthcare for a long time. I've worked at companies like Stryker, designing surgical equipment, One Medical Group in the primary care space. A lot of folks will probably know that name. And I've done several startups, most recently NurseGrid. So, I kind of joke, I've done everything from designing equipment to selling health plans to training nurses at the night shift to crawling around in hospital ceilings pulling fiber optic cable at 2 a.m. So I've got a real kind of appreciation for some of the practical realities that make healthcare all come together.
Nice. That's great. And, the thing we love at Healthcare Scene is trying to really find the practical things that are happening and not just the theoretical. I think people spend too much time on the theoretical. So I think it's great that you're working with so many different clients. So maybe start off with that. What are some examples where you see predictive analytics in action today?
Yeah, so there's a lot of great examples of predictive analytics today. I think organizations, as they've undergone digital transformation, are now realizing that the investments they made in EMR systems and in other digital clinical applications really represent a rich opportunity to think about analytics. These systems are amassing huge amounts of data. A lot of that EMR transition happened here in the U.S. between 2011 and 2016, and so they've got a couple years of historical data, which is great for predictive analytics. Data is really the precursor for predictive analytics. So, on the clinical side, lots of interesting use cases looking to address hospital-acquired conditions. So sepsis is a really common one where folks are building predictive models. Several of the EMR vendors offer these models as part of the platform. Other organizations are building their own models, but really trying to understand who are those patients that might be going septic at any given time, and can I build a model that helps me intervene earlier? As you know, sepsis, is really time dependent in terms of the severity that it has. Operationally, lots of interesting models to help improve staffing ratios. So how do I look at historical forecasts for admissions to think about how I staff up more efficiently? Inside the hospital, more of a kind of a clinical acute use case is how do I allocate rapid response teams? This is actually an area that Intel's been pretty involved in. We worked with a healthcare organization, Sharp Healthcare, down in San Diego, to build a rapid response team model that would assign a risk score to patients in real time, so those rapid response teams knew where to go. And we've open sourced that so other hospitals can adopt it. And then revenue cycle management is a really hot area for predictive analytics right now. In the U.S., businesses still pay a majority of healthcare cost, and many businesses have moved to high deductible health plans, which means patients are paying more out of pocket than they traditionally have. And so how do you collect on that? How do you put the processes in place? And then how do you sort of segment and address those different patients to ensure collections are coming in on time and make recommendations on what the best course of action is for different patient segments is another really hot area. I'd say for folks that are new to predictive analytics, thinking about healthcare, and even beyond healthcare, there's a great book out there by Eric Siegel. It's aptly titled Predictive Analytics, and it's really written in more of a sort of a novelist type format, not heavily technical, but he's got dozens of great examples of where predictive analytics are used across a number of industries. And I think that's really important for healthcare because some of these sort of bigger data predictive analytics use cases are newer to healthcare. These are things that e-commerce and the financial industry have been doing for a long time. And so there's a lot that healthcare can learn from looking at other industries and how they've implemented predictive analytics.
Great. And when you look at that, some of the benefits are apparent, right? If you're doing RCM and you improve revenue, that makes sense why they would invest that way. What are the other benefits that are really driving the decision-making and the investment in predictive analytics?
Yeah, so, I think at the end of the day, you want to be able to tie it down to dollars. So, if we go back through, the sepsis prediction that we talked about, improving outcomes there has a significant impact to the health system's bottom line, right? That's one of those conditions, hospital-acquired conditions, that has, some really specific financial implications around it. So that's very important. Staffing ratio is hugely important. So do I have the right amount of staff to get patients through the hospital? So I'm not going on, ER divert and having to send patients to other healthcare organizations, which is lost revenue for me. So, throughput, operational excellence, again, that all ties back to moving patients through. So, the benefits, if done right, the benefits of predictive analytics should be quantifiable down to sort of financial measures. And that may come through clinical, that may come through finance, that may come through operations. But at the end of the day, what's really important is that those get lined up to a clear business case with a demonstrable ROI, and you can tie it back to it. So it's really all over the board. And you think, really whatever data you have, how can you use that to do things more intelligently? And you can find an ROI for it that way.
Great. Although I think one of the challenges when I look at this, and one of my fears with predictive analytics, is exactly what you just said, that you need to have the data in order to do the predictive analytics. It's almost, chicken and egg thing, but you know that, you need the egg to get the chicken, right? You need the data to get the predictive analytics. And my fear is that the small organizations, small health systems, small hospitals, small practices, they're not going to have the data or the processing power, possibly even the money to be able to do these type of predictive analytics. Do you think that's the case, or do you think that we'll be able to scale down the predictive analytics so that even smaller hospitals, smaller health systems are going to be able to do this? Or, how is that going to play out for these smaller healthcare organizations?
Yeah, so I'd answer that in probably two ways, sort of yes and no. So I think it depends on the use cases that you look at. If I'm thinking of one of the more advanced use cases for predictive analytics and artificial intelligence, in some cases, around precision health. So I want to be able to predict and provide input into specific outcomes for oncology patients. Getting those data sets requires collaboration or a larger health system coming together to have a large enough pool of data. So I guess for certain use cases, I would agree with you. If I'm a small hospital, I may not be able to amass enough data to be able to deliver on a certain predictive use case. That said, over 80% of non-federal acute care hospitals have an EHR today. Those are kind of the latest stats up on the healthit.gov dashboard. So there are plenty of use cases that any hospital can start with. So I think you're going to have to look at, as a hospital, think about what data do I have and what can I do with predictive analytics. So it's a little bit of yes and no. I hear this question a lot of times: do I have enough data to get started? I think it's important to think about these predictive models as somewhat similar to software, right? They're never really done. You could always add new data. You could always try new techniques. What's really important is, is the result of the model good enough to improve upon the status quo? And you get to that answer by rooting the predictive model and the work that you're doing around a clear business use case. Our sepsis detection today is X. Can I build a model that's good enough to be incrementally better than that? Right? And what does that increment need to look like to really be valuable to my organization? So, the rapid response team model I mentioned earlier, we built that with just structured data out of the EMR. No unstructured data, just getting started with structured fields. This was clinical information being captured about the patient. And we were able to build a model that had over 80% predictive ability for finding those patients that needed it. So I think any healthcare organization can get started. Don't be afraid of the data you don't have. Really focus on the data you do have and root that in a solid business case. And oftentimes there is a good opportunity to think about how you could use predictive analytics.
There's so much potential there available with predictive analytics, but what do you see as some of the biggest barriers really to adopting these predictive analytics in healthcare? I mean, as you said, healthcare is a little bit behind some of the other industries. So what are the barriers stopping us?
Yeah, so I think one thing I like to point out to organizations is a lot of healthcare has been using predictive analytics for a long time. What's really changed in the last few years is probably the size and the complexity of the data that we're trying to run predictive analytics on. So that's opened up a lot of new use cases that are pretty interesting. But if you go back to forecasting admissions, with regression models and Excel worksheets on your PC, folks have been doing that, and that's predictive analytics, right? I mean, it's sort of small scale predictive analytics, small data sets, but that's really what it is. So organizations have this capability. What's the barriers today are, how do we do predictive analytics with these massive data sets from multiple clinical applications, bringing that all together into an environment that's unified, that's interoperable, that I can run analytics on? How do I do that sometimes in the cloud? So there's a lot of technology changes that have come with, say, today's version of predictive analytics to really capitalize on the opportunities there. From a technology perspective, I'd say, I guess backing up, there's really three things I think about. So there's the technology, there's the people, and the process. And this is a pretty common, three-step framework for a lot of types of challenges. From a technology perspective, the technology is really there, right? So the compute you need, the storage you need, the networking you need, you can buy enough of that and put it on-prem to do these build a large analytics cluster and run it, or you can rent a lot of that hardware on Amazon or on Azure and one of the big public cloud providers, depending on what makes the most sense for you. So I don't think the technology a lot of times is the limiting factor today. I think where I see a lot of organizations struggle as they start these programs is in the people in the process. So finding and recruiting and retaining top talent that can come in and build predictive models that can scale across these large data sets, and these are folks that need to be able to bring the data together, make it, clean it up. There's a huge amount of work in ETL, extract, transform, load, data cleansing in healthcare still, and then build these models that can scale. Those folks are in high demand, right? You're not going to find many of them out in monster.com looking for a job. People have hired them up. So how do you bring them into your organization? Healthcare is sometimes at a disadvantage in terms of how much they can pay these individuals when Wall Street and tech companies are looking to bring them in. Healthcare does have a unique advantage there, though, in sort of the mission and the purpose that you get from working in healthcare. I think anyone you talk to that's in and around healthcare is really driven by that purpose to save lives. So so I think healthcare organizations can kind of use that to their advantage to attract and that talent. Also thinking through, how do you make sure these people are successful in your organization? What's the reporting structure? How do you make sure they have interesting new work to work on consistently? So, data scientists are problem solvers, right? They like to get in and solve new problems, work with new data. We see a lot of organizations that get them started with that, and then they have to end up doing sort of mundane application management or database management, and guess what? In a couple of months, they're gone, right? Because they're looking for something new. So, understanding what drives them and making sure you create an environment that can retain them over time is really important, because they're expensive to recruit and they're really expensive to get trained up. A lot of what they bring to the table, in addition to the data science, is that understanding of the industry and the ability to provide some context to the data. The other thing to think about is process. So, historical kind of descriptive analytics, traditional BI, we're looking in the past, right? We have data, we're looking at what happened, and there's no sort of time tax on when we want to act upon that data. With predictive analytics, there's a really tight window from when I make the prediction to being able to act on that, where the prediction is still good. And so, if I'm making my prediction too far out in time, then the predictive ability goes down. If I make it too close to when the event might occur, the organization doesn't have time to act on it. So thinking about how to modify workflows, either business process workflows or clinical workflows, to be adaptable in real time based on data coming in. How are you going to crunch the results of that data and then present it back out to the clinician or physician? Is it coming to the EMR? Is it a standalone application? All of this change management, workflow change, is a major undertaking as you start to be in a position to adapt in real time to data. And so that really requires some strong internal capabilities in change management, or a great partner to come in and help you with that. But it's something organizations should think about. It's much more than a technology challenge as you think about really integrating predictive analytics into your day-to-day workflow.
Yeah, I think that actually scares a lot of organizations. I'll never forget the story I heard of a predictive analytic for patients that were crashing in the hospital, and they created these great predictive analytics that were so good. They'd send their team out because the patient was predicted to be one that was at risk for crashing, and they would go out and they wouldn't know what to do, because all of the tools that their team normally used were assuming that the patient was already starting to crash, whereas they predicted it so early. The team had to rethink, okay, what are our new processes, that we can use because we predicted it so early. So I think that's a huge part of the challenge, is not just, okay, we predicted it, now what? What do our people do? What's our process now that it's done?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so, as I look at that, though, I think that is the next generation of predictive analytics, is moving the predictive analytics to the point of care. So where do you see that? And, what's the right way to push that data down to the point of care?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. So how do we get it into the the clinician or the physician's hands, and then how do we move beyond here's the prediction to here's what the recommended courses of action would be based on this prediction? And a lot of folks talk about that as prescriptive analytics. So it's not just making the prediction, but it's following it up with recommended courses of action. And those may be based on, business process, sort of hard coded into the application. So if prediction is X, then recommended business process is Y or Z. Or it may be based on sort of data that you've collected about outcomes over time, using different types of techniques. And so this is sometimes, the prescriptive space is a lot of times where we see folks sort of get into more advanced uses of artificial intelligence. And I'll just touch on that for a second, because I know that term gets kicked around a lot. Predictive analytics, in a lot of ways, is where I see organizations first get started with AI. Machine learning is a subset of sort of the broader AI class of technologies. And so a lot of organizations will get started there. Alongside machine learning, you've got deep learning and you've got cognitive systems like reasoning systems and logic-based systems that could be used as well. Prescriptive, I think, is one of those use cases where cognitive systems really come into play, where these systems can store certain events over time and be able to correlate sequences of events that had the highest outcome back to the current event that you have. So they're able to similarity match and then provide recommended courses of action. So I think that's where we start to get some great adoption by healthcare providers, is not only here's the prediction, but here's some recommended courses of action. It's a fine balance, right? And in a lot of cases, I think the right A in front of intelligence is augmented instead of artificial, right? This is something that rides along and that can help you be more effective. But at the end of the day, the decision still resides with the physician, obviously, in what course of action to take. I think the more that we can tie the predictive or prescriptive back into the applications that the provider is using today, so you're not adding more layers of complexity to their workflow, the better. Asking them to now go to yet another application to find the results is challenging, and there's a lot of information stored in these core clinical apps. And so you really, I think, have to be cognizant of the existing workflow and introduce this new technology as seamless as possible. So I say get it into what they're using today. Make sure it's mobile. As we think about the future of healthcare, it's increasingly mobile. Healthcare systems are getting large and complex, and make sure that it provides additional insight to help them. And with that, it's really important to have a mechanism to capture whether or not that physician used the prediction, whether or not they followed that recommended course of action. That's a critical set of data that needs to be fed back into these predictive models to make them better over time. We did some work with Montefiore out in New York, where they built a semantic data lake, and in their application layer for the physician, as they rolled this out in pilot, anytime the physician chose to use or not use the prediction, there was a little pop-up window that came up, and they could explain why they chose to use it or why they didn't choose to use it. Incredibly valuable information back for the team building the model to understand what those real-world implications were of trying to roll this out.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges with this, right? Because if you give a predictive analytic or even the prescriptive analytics even more to a doctor and it's the wrong one, you burn the bridge that then they don't trust the predictive analytics anymore. And so, first time they might give you a pass. The second time they starts to just erode that relationship. I think related to that, one of the challenges is that the predictive models and the predictive analytics often are based on data that's incorrect or it's in the wrong context, which I think is another one of those challenges. Humans are really great at context. So a doctor that doesn't understand how analytics works and how predictive analytics works would look at it and say, man, this system is so stupid because it didn't understand this context, right? But which humans do really easily, and I think analytics don't. So I think that's the other challenge, right, is how do you create the trust between the doctor and the predictive analytics? And I think context and understanding that context is an important part of that.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and it can, like you said, it can make or break the program really early on if you don't do that wisely. I think this is one of those areas that I tie back a little bit to people. So picking the right use case to start with as you think about your predictive analytics program, and in a lot of ways, you could think about a predictive analytics program like a startup. Right. So initially, you're going to have a very small set of people. They're going to be sort of scarcely funded, probably, drinking Mountain Dews and eating donuts all through the night trying to get this thing off the ground. And there's a process of finding product market fit for your analytics program, very similar to the process that startups go through. We've got our initial product. It's not pretty. It may not work that great, but we've got to find that initial product market fit and kind of work through those first iterations. So an experienced leader of your, call it your data science program, wherever you want to call where the predictive analytics are done, should have some demonstrated experience understanding which use cases to pick and where to start in the organization. And part of that is understanding the technology, and the data that's available. You need to pick somewhere where you have amount of data that you have a fairly high level of confidence you can build a model. But two is understanding the internal politics. Right? Does it make sense to start off by going after a clinical use case where you're going to come in and work with the clinical team before you've demonstrated what the ability of your team is? Maybe it does if your organization's open to that, but maybe it makes more sense to start somewhere more of an operational or finance role where you can show how the team was able to deliver results and use that as an introduction to the clinical team. Hey, we've demonstrated success in other parts of the organization. We'd love to work with you collaboratively to find a way to build something. let's get in and talk about what your needs are. What are those top use cases that you have that we could work on together? So I think that's where an experienced leader can help steer this fledgling program through some of the politics and early stages to really get it into a position where it has the internal credibility and the internal support, hopefully up to the executive level. Because really, we've done some work with the International Institute of Analytics to show that, analytics programs that have executive sponsorship have a higher likelihood of success than those that are more grassroots over the long term. So building that support over time is really important, and maybe it makes sense to come back to those clinical use cases a little bit later on.
That's great, and I love the concept of doing it as a startup, because startups fail, and people expect that and understand that idea. And I think also many organizations try to boil the ocean with their efforts, and then they wonder why they don't get results, right? Where startups understand they can't boil the ocean; they have to do a specific use case. So that's a great example. Well, let's wrap it up here with kind of that final question. Where do you see all of this headed? Where is predictive analytics going in the next, let's just say, 5 to 10 years? What are the real practical things that organizations should be looking to in the next 5 to 10 years for their organization?
Yeah, so I think when I talk to organizations about this, I like to think about predictive analytics or talk about it as one step on a broader analytics journey. So, many organizations, just about everybody's doing BI today and sort of traditional analytics looking backwards. Predictive analytics, like I said, it's that first sort of introduction to some more advanced large data set and analytics capabilities like machine learning, right? So that really gets you started. And that builds a lot of organizational muscle to start to think about the business process implications we talked about earlier, right? How do we change workflows in real time? Who are the people that we need? How do we build this all in the organization, get support? What that opens the door for is more advanced analytics techniques going forward. So we start to think about deep learning. There's a lot of discussion and work going on right now around the use of deep learning to extract tumors from images, right? In the US, access to radiologists is pretty good. We look at that in technology is really a way to the world. Getting access to a radiologist is very difficult. I was in China about a month and a half ago, and a massive population, right, with a very small set of radiologists, and just some small policy changes as to what you can now go in and get a CT scan or MRI for could drastically change the supply and demand there. So analytics sets the stage to start looking at other AI type technologies. Beyond deep learning, you've got cognitive computing that can come into play. We talked about earlier, systems that are able to do more deep reasoning based analytics, kind of like 3-dimensional graph databases that can make correlations you never thought. So what I hope happens, and what we see happening, is that the use of predictive analytics demonstrates the power of data, and it gets organizations thinking about seriously, what is our data strategy? What are those data sources that we have today? How do we enrich those and make those better? And what are those data sources that we need in the future? Having the data, again, is that critical precursor. So I think organizations are seeing that. There's been proof in what predictive analytics can provide. It's getting organizations to think analytically, to ask data-based questions. How can we solve questions with data? How do we make data a part of our culture and have an appreciation for the power and the potential there? Which means more support for programs, larger teams, and more expansive work. And that all leads to, the more data you have, leads to the ability to deploy new types of analytics, to look at larger, more complex models that span new data sources. I think one of the areas that'll be really interesting to watch is how social data, like things like where you live, income level, access to transportation. There's folks doing some early work there, but we need to move healthcare to more of a state of preventative medicine. And to do that, we need to engage patients for the 99.9% of the time where they're not in a clinical setting. And that means bringing the data that you generate about your life into the clinical consideration process so we can understand how to engage you when you go home, how to engage you through your social circle. How do we use social circles to help improve people to engage in their health and their wellness and be more preventative? So I think that's what we're really seeing in the next 5 to 10. We're going to see an appreciation for the data. Hospitals are going to start to build larger data sets, start to implement and get familiar and comfortable with new and more complex types of AI technology, and really look at how do we build these larger models that allow us to engage patients in their health and wellness to reduce the risk of chronic disease and bring healthcare costs down in the U.S.
Excellent. I love the ideas of creating that culture of asking the right questions, and that culture of making sure the data is accurate, and, and using that to then build the culture of predictive analytics is great. Thanks so much, Andy. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot about predictive analytics and what's really happening. I think a lot of people think it's a pie in the sky thing, but it's not. It's happening today in many organizations, and it's going to become even more widespread. So thanks so much to our guest, Andy Bartley, Senior Solutions Architect in the Health and Life Sciences Group at Intel. And thanks for everyone that watched live or the recorded version. If you enjoyed this content, you can check out more great healthcare IT content at healthcarescene.com. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.